So it's my great pleasure today to be having this discussion with Nitin Rakesh, who is the CEO of Mphasis, and Jerry Wind, who is the Lauder Professor Emeritus and Professor of Marketing at Wharton School, University of Pennsylvania. Now, Nitin, Jerry, let me just start by congratulating you on the release of your book, which is called Transformation in the Time of Crisis. It was a wonderful read. I had the pleasure of reading it. And I have so many questions for both of you.
Thank you for having us.
So I thought we'd start out with, obviously, the first and foremost question, which is, what was the inspiration for this book? Did you start when the pandemic started, or had you started writing this book before the pandemic and just sort of had an inkling that we were on the verge of something?
You know, the book actually went through its own transformation, linked very much to the crisis. So I think it's a living example of the shift and change we had to make. So Jerry and I started collaborating on this book a couple of years ago, and the idea was effectively born out of a workshop we did at Wharton School, with some of our large clients, mostly enterprises who were dealing with a number of disruptive changes in their businesses. Right? Think retail with Amazon, Netflix with media, PayPal with payments, banks getting unbundled. So I think the whole concept of that workshop was, how do you deal with disruption? How do you create a framework that you can apply proactively to your own business? And we titled the workshop "Architecture of Disruption." And Jerry and I were having lunch, and I doodled out a little piece of on a little piece of paper, a little drawing, which was my conceptual idea of what enterprises should be doing to deal with this disruption. And Jerry said, "Well, this is great. Think about writing a paper." I said, "Well, sure, maybe." And then he said, "You know what, even better, think about writing a book." So we started writing the book, I'd say a couple of years ago. Jerry was very persuasive, and of course, a great opportunity for me to learn. And then we were, I would say, quite a far distance down about a year ago. I would say maybe first draft of the manuscript. We hadn't done the finishing, we hadn't done the editing. And then the crisis hit, and it took us a couple of weeks to understand that everything we'd been talking about in the book was actually starting to come true, just at a very different pace. Right? The pace of change and the rate of change was much higher, but all the same constructs from things that were disrupting enterprises, especially driven by the customer expectations and the ability for you to deal with your consumers. And give them a great experience remotely, digitally. Everything was just happening in real fast forward. And so Jerry and I, it took us a couple of weeks, I think, to understand that. And then we decided to go headlong and pivot the book, and effectively, here we are.
Thanks, Nitin. You were talking, actually, that was going to be my next question, and I'm glad you touched upon that, about the pace of things. And one of the things that we've observed during the pandemic has been, with the pace of everything, really, it went from, even with the pandemic, it was like, there's a virus, and then it went suddenly to a global pandemic. And then suddenly, almost overnight, businesses had this need to go digital, and not just full-on digital, but we entered this world of 24/7 digitalization where everything moved online. And even countries like India, for example, which was kind of trudging along until then with digitalization, suddenly went full pelt into the digital age, even with SMEs and grocery stores. But it's suddenly, I know everyone's looking at it as this new phenomenon, but do you think businesses are just rushing into this trend because they're in this mode for surviving and overlooking certain vital or maybe even perhaps fundamental changes while incorporating this rapid digitalization? Are there pitfalls?
That's really a great question. I think it's both. I think that it's not just rushing into the digital kind of era. The trend was there. What happened is a huge acceleration of this trend. Some of the estimates are that what would have taken before the crisis like 10 years happened in few months. So the trend was there. So it's the natural and logical thing to happen. But at the same time, you cannot ignore the other changes that's happening. So I think that you cannot just do digital transformation and forget everything else, because everything is interrelated. And you have to address, number one, that the crisis is not only the pandemic. We're really facing like 5 crises at the same time. It's like, the ultimate combination of these crises. When you talk about with the pandemic, the economic crisis, when you talk about the scream for social justice that's happening around the world, when you talk about the climate change, and when you're dealing with kind of more recently in the US, especially the issue of the ideological divide in the country. These are huge challenges. And I think everyone has to take opportunity of the fact that the speed of change that Nitin was talking about that's happening now forces us to start addressing some of the challenges and the basic trends. Think about other trends. Consumer empowerment, kind of the consumer is changing, skeptical consumers, empowered consumers. How do you deal with this? And you have to deal with this and the other kind of fundamental change in society as a result of all these kind of forces of change. Think about the shift from a traditional shareholder orientation to a stakeholder orientation. Was thinking more in terms of how do you really address the needs of society? How do you have a positive social impact, which is so important, especially for the younger generation. So I think it's not a single change. It is really a multifaceted change that try to address the dramatic changes that happened during the crisis and created this multi-phase crisis and the fundamental trends of society.
Absolutely, Jerry. I think it totally resonates with me because it kind of snowballed with it started with the pandemic, of course, but I was just thinking the world has never really seen so many things coming, and it kind of reminds me of the English adage, it often pours but seldom rains. And suddenly it had, you had a pandemic, you had a healthcare crisis, you had an economic crisis, climate change. So I don't think countries around the world have been bombarded with so many natural disasters as they have. It started with the bushfires in Australia, the cyclone, typhoon Amphan, and then there was all these civil rights movements, whether it was the Black Lives Matter in the US. And you talked about the consumers becoming more conscious, a conscious consumerism and this need to sustain. So there are a lot of challenges that businesses are up against. Suddenly, it's not business as usual. It really isn't business as usual. It has to be from top to bottom, real change, not just, eyewash. So how do businesses tackle that? And is digitalization, I think what I'm trying to say is digitalization really the magic pill, the lack of better word, that's going to solve all these problems, or may we create a path to it?
Go ahead, Jerry.
No, digitalization is a necessary part of the change, but it's not the magic pill. The magic pill is a fundamental need to realize that we're facing a new reality, that the good old days, in quote, are not coming back. You cannot go back. You really have to think about a new reality. And the new reality has to address all the challenges that you just articulated. And this implies, number one, that you have to challenge, and then change your fundamental mental model, the way you look at the world. You have to come up with a new vision for yourself. What type of company do you want to have? What type of organization do you want to have? What's your legacy? Think about yourself 5 to 10 years from now. What would you like to be? And then once you do it, you really have to realize that you have to undertake fundamental changes in almost everything that you're currently doing and kind of prepare. And that's what the book is all about, basically trying to suggest new principles, new way of thinking about the world. Our first principle is really challenging your mental model. And then how do you really start implementing it throughout the organization?
I think I just want to add one thing to that. So, you talked about this business and, it's not business as usual. And I think what Jerry is really saying is it's never going to be business as usual ever again. So you really have to, make this the new usual. And the sooner you shift your mental model to accepting that this is going to be the new reality, the sooner you can actually start taking action in aligning your business goals, the way you deal with your consumers, the way you deal with other stakeholders, and just the way you architect your whole, business architecture will start shifting very quickly. And I think that's why, if you think about all the principles we talked about, the very first principle is the foundation of everything, because change will start when you actually realize that you need to make that change. And I think, you talked about the fact that, this COVID crisis pushed people towards digitalization. I think a number of those things were inching up on every business. And what the crisis did was effectively became a tipping point, right? And, if you kind of think about tipping point, even in the book Tipping Point, they talk about a pandemic, actually creating a tipping point for many things. And a pandemic itself gets to a tipping point, in its own life cycle. So I think this tipping point moment has galvanized and kind of acted as a catalyst for many different changes that were already creeping up on us. And but one thing is, the common theme that runs across every industry, every geography, every market, is that the consumer is now asking for a whole different way of interaction, a whole different way of dealing. It's not just dealing digitally; it's also things like sustainability, the whole environmental awareness, ESG. All of these are themes that are not new, that came out in the last 12 months, but now they've suddenly all become intertwined with each other, and hence extremely important to use this accelerant and the tipping point that we've seen to really forward your agenda and your goals. Because this isn't just about surviving the crisis, having digital interactions. It's actually using the crisis to create a whole new construct and a whole new business model.
Absolutely. Actually, I was going to ask you, because when I was reading the book, what really struck me was the 8 principles that you talk about, and what businesses can then use these to customize and implement to build resilience. So can we talk a little bit about that, what these 8 principles are and why they're so important?
Go, Jerry.
Well, let's start with the first one was actually the challenging mental models. And while we talked about this, let me add one other component to this. And let's think about the experience of the last year. So if you look at the experience of the last year, work from home actually has been quite successful for most companies. When you think about all universities and schools around the world switched to e-learning. When you think about e-commerce grew unprecedented amount compared to traditional retailing. Telemedicine is now almost kind of on the rise. Zoom and other communication platforms are the norm, kind of as common as phone was before the crisis. Many art museums and cultural institutions moved to digital and suddenly realized, wow, there is a whole world out there. I don't have to limit my audience to the local community. I can look at it globally. When you look at this, given these lessons, going back to the pre-crisis modes of behavior and ignore these changes misses enormous opportunities. So fundamentally, what we're seeing here, we're seeing a situation that not only we have the trends, but we have an experience of the last year that suggests a new way of working actually can work. And we have to start thinking about what is the new type of work, what is the new type of, life that people are going to have. So I think that this is the fundamental change. This is the part of the challenging mental models. The second principle that we have, which is really critical and relate to one of the points we discussed before, the empowered consumer, is the reimagine and reinvent the approach to customers and stakeholders. And I think your first question was, how do we get together? I think one of the reasons really we got together and it hit and we kind of were able to work together, that Nitin, while being kind of one of the technology leaders, is really a marketing person at heart. He realizes that and he created an emphasis is an amazing development, but they developed the front to back approach to technology, which starts with the consumer, which is kind of one of the foundations that we have in the book. And that's really critical. And when you see a technologist that really understands that everything has to start with the consumer needs now and the evolving needs of the consumer and how to understand them, and the interplay between the two was a natural chemistry almost from day one. So I think this is kind of the essence, and that our chapter, the second principle, is really focused on the consumer. But don't just give lip service to this. Redesign your organization to try really to be able to accomplish this. And all the way to how do you start creating co-creation with the consumer? You know, an incredibly important, powerful concept of the co-creation, which implies you need now to start having kind of more of a win-win orientation in relation with the consumer. And then extending it, we cannot just focus on the consumer, but focus on all stakeholders as we move from the shareholder orientation to a stakeholder orientation. So that's the second principle. Let me give one more, and then kind of one of my favorites, and then I'll turn it to Nitin. So one of my favorite is the whole need to reinvent the talent strategy of the firm. Historically, firms believe that all they have to do is, let's hire the best possible people and let's go with this. The reality is that there's at least today about 1/3 of the US workforce that does not want to work for companies. They want to be independent. That's the gig economy. And that's globally. That's a trend which goes globally. So how can a company ignore this global talent that can help them solve their problem? That's the whole idea of open innovation and open talent. And open innovation, the data on this is absolutely staggering. It suggests that if you're engaged in open innovation, you can achieve 4 to 5x the speed of traditional work if you're doing this in-house, and 8 to 10x the cost savings compared to doing it in-house. It's when you think about these numbers, there are staggering numbers. What it means, you have to rethink your whole talent strategy. You cannot, no company can hire the best talent in the world. The best talent in the world does not want to work for companies. And even companies like organizations like NASA, which you would expect the glamour of NASA, and they have 17,000 people, everyone would like to work there. They extensively use open innovation in almost everything they do. So the reality is we have to rethink. This goes back to the mental model. You have to rethink your entire talent strategy. And the question is, how do I, how can I attract the best talent in the world? And then what are the implications to the internal talent I need? And what type of competencies do I need internally in terms of the designers and the integrators of all the work that I can bring from outside? So these are kind of quick examples of 3 of our kind of principles. Nitin, you want to take on?
I think, Jerry, you said it right. So, if you think about it, we start with the shifting of the mental model, then we very quickly move to the customer and the stakeholder. Then we talk about how do you use principles of digital transformation to drive a very highly personalized service, because I think that to me is actually very important, because one of the reasons why there's rampant disruption in every industry is that the customer expectations have moved away from being treated as one amongst many to being treated individually, right? We are still, especially in the services economy, we are still living in the era of mass customization, and I think that at least the customer expectation and experience based on their interactions with the digital startups and the large, experiences driven through, Amazon Prime or Netflix, is that you should know who I am, if you're a bank, instead of, just treating me as one amongst every other customer. And then the only way you can give me personalized services if I am rich enough or if I have enough balances for you to actually have a private banker call me, right? So, how do you move away from that, mass customization to hyper personalization? And then I think we talk a lot about, in the remaining principles, it's all about how to do it. How do you get into your adjacencies? How do you build, speed and agility in your business model? How do you create an innovation and experimentation mindset? How to set up that experimentation across, innovation horizons? Because a lot of those things are important for you to build a sustainable, framework that you can apply repeatedly to your own business. So I think, we start with foundational elements of mental model, customer, stakeholder, and then we're going to start moving into how to go about it.
Thank you both for that really, really amazing kind of lowdown on the 8 principles. And, both of you made some really excellent points I want to unpack a little bit. So you touched upon things like the mindset and this idea of sustainability, which is kind of echoing throughout every sector right now, if I'm not mistaken. Everyone's talking about how innovation needs to be sustainable, how businesses need to be sustainable, and just kind of creating this harmony between, and Jerry mentioned about making consumers stakeholders rather than just a consumer, and working and creating this sort of ecosystem. But there let's talk a little bit first about smaller enterprises, because this is something that I was reading a lot during the pandemic about, smaller businesses trying to do all of this, and digitalization being an enabler for this, but at the same time trying to address things like supply chain disruptions, or constant consumer demand because of the 24/7 digitalization, upskilling challenges, infrastructure problems. So since the book is called Transformation, how does this transformation happen?
Well, you want to start, so it starts by changing your mental models. Then what you have to do is basically, I think, you have to work in parallel in terms of what do I have to do to survive. So the initial instinct of survival. So what do I have to do in order to survive the current crisis? But I think we view it that there is a huge opportunities in times of crisis. You don't want to waste the crisis and not really to create new opportunities, which means just being in a survival mode will not make it. So you really have to, in parallel, ask the question, what type of company do you want to be? What's your vision? And we have a whole section in the book that talks about how do you create idealized design? How do you kind of go beyond, kind of what you're currently doing? And a great example would be Kroger, for example, that came with the vision of zero hunger, zero waste. It's an amazing, strong vision, both for society and for the company, to achieve zero hunger, zero waste by 2025. And they have a plan how to get there. Every company should have a vision, what they're trying to be, what type of company you want to have in 5 to 10 years, you decide on the time horizon. And then what do you have to do today to start getting there? And in today's environment, with the rapid change in the environmental conditions of competition, of the consumer, the pandemic, everything around us, you really cannot, just go the traditional, slow, long-term planning. What you have to do is really have to start designing a whole series of experiments and start moving with them. If the experiment works, scale it big. If it fails, dump it and start something else. Try experiment with something else. So what you really want to do, it's a new way of managing that we're suggesting that you have to do, and do things in parallel. That's the reason, one of the key points that Nitin mentioned before, that we're talking about experimentation in a different time horizon. So the experiments is not only, forget the sequential way of doing things, start thinking in terms of parallel, and how do you design experiments that are critical today for survival, but also experiment that will build the future, will allow you to get toward the future. So I think if you do this, if you focus on change your mental models, come with an ideal future, what do you want to be, design the strategy along this line, and with a whole series of continuous experimentation, you can transform. It's doable.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is what's happened with this shift away from quote unquote, you have to be an omni-channel business. You can deal with your consumers in physical store format. Doesn't matter, whether you're a product or a service. With internet and then digital, that is very quickly pivoted away from, all the multiple investments required. If you're a small business, you have limited capital to invest. If you really double down and say, I want to be a digital native, digital first business, that becomes a very big leveler, right? Because consumer loyalty is actually moved away from big brands. It's moved to, really good experiences. If you give an amazing experience, customers will come to you. And hence, this democratization of your business model enabled and powered by tech. I think if you bring that element of the focus, in addition to what Jerry said, you should be able to find what's the best way to construct a model where you become extremely core. And I think we've seen multiple examples of companies that that have attracted huge, especially just in the last 12 months, huge swaths of new consumers, and we've had things like, Clubhouse born in the crisis and actually gone on to become one of the biggest sensations of the last 12 months. So I think that the ability to apply, everything that's around available, as tools, but just having a vision of what you're really trying to create, becomes a very, very powerful way to build up a business, no matter, your size and your ability to invest.
One other quick point, especially for small businesses, realize regardless of your size, regardless how large you are, no one can win by themselves. Even the largest company has to deal with the network. They have to create, they can create their own ecosystem, or they can join an ecosystem. So the small firm, kind of not only that they can benefit from all the trend today that really leading, as Nitin said, which is a very important point, the democratization of, kind of everything you do, and including supply chain. Because of the trading companies and others, every tiny small factory anywhere in the world can be part of the global trade. That democratization, what Lee and Fang has done in the supply chain area, really democratized the manufacturing for anyone in the world. So the small firm today is in the best position ever to try to make an impact, survive, and grow and succeed because of all these enabling factors, and because they have really to start deciding, okay, which network, which ecosystem do I want to join? And then the challenge for them is how can they become now the network orchestrators to try to orchestrate their own network to achieve their objectives.
Thanks both. This has been such a great discussion, and I'm aware of the time, so I'll wind this up very quickly for a very, very quick last question. We talked about smaller organizations, and just as a final question, I've always heard that bigger organizations are the ones that are more averse to change. So how can businesses basically change the mindset that you talk about in your book, which is so vital to bring about sustainable change?
Go ahead, Jerry.
Well, I think it goes back to some of the items discussed, the leadership. And if they're lucky enough and they have an enlightened CEO, the leader, they have to change their mindset, they have to change their melamah, they have to realize the opportunities and start acting on this. I think a sense of urgency is critical in today's environment, urgency and acting. You cannot, kind of go the traditional way of analysis paralysis. You have to be decisive, you have to realize that change is needed, come up with a course of action and experiment, and have the courage to do it. And this applies to large organizations, small organizations, all of them. You have really to do it. You don't have a choice. If you won't do it, you will not survive. And if you're not lucky enough and you're not in the organization that you have an enlightened CEO like Nitin, what you have to do, every person who has responsibility, start changing in your own area. That's the reason our book is not only for CEOs. Our book is for everyone who is running a brand or a function, a business, because everyone has the responsibility to do this environment. If you in your area want to succeed, you have to change.
I think it's an existential issue, and I think the change really starts at the top. If the mental model doesn't shift at the top of the house, it's going to be an extremely difficult proposition. But the good news is we've seen so many great examples of companies that are that are quote unquote have been around longer than the internet revolution has been around, that actually have made this shift quite dramatically. If you think of we talk about the disruption in retail, in the same business, the biggest retailer that has been around pre-Amazon was Walmart, and look at the amazing work Walmart has done in shifting their business model and keeping in lockstep with their consumers. Same thing with Target, right? I mean, you wouldn't have imagined some of the biggest companies in that retail business will actually not just be up for the challenge, but actually be thriving through this because they're also gaining from the same consolidation Amazon is gaining through, right? Similarly, a great example is a company like Microsoft, right? From having gone to everything licensed, everything closed, everything paid for, to actually being one of the biggest open source contributors because they now own GitHub, which is the open source community, is a massive transformation just in a very short amount of time. But it all started with the leadership change at the top. So I think absolutely the fundamental aspect really is the change has to start at the top. And that's why when I talk when I do many of these interactions, my biggest advice always is you have to realize that there is a change and that we are never going back to be business as usual. And I think that realization really is the start of the whole revolution, so to speak.
Nitin, Jerry, it has been such a fantastic discussion. I've certainly learned a lot. And it's great to have your insights. Having read the book, it's really great to have these insights from the two of you as well, because it just kind of shines a whole different dimension to the wonderful and really, really great ideas that you've put in your book. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your extremely busy schedules to do this interview. And I look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you for having us.